Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This right here is a Little Blue Book, and it just happens to be Little Blue Book number 727. And it is titled The Psychology of the Affections, written by Vance Randolph. And it is copyrighted 1924. So we are now reading part 2. And we left off at the top of page 19. And we'll go back to the sentence. Lagerborg regards feeling as weak and unlocalized sensation. As soon as its intensity is increased, it can be localized and is then called a sensation proper. There are 3 classes of feelings: unpleasantness, pleasantness, and common feelings. The corresponding sensations are pain, sexual, and visceral or kinesthetic sensations. Lagerborg seems to assume the existence of algedonic afferent nerves. Pleasantness and unpleasantness may result directly from the mechanical stimulation of these nerves, as well as indirectly by the nutritional process of the tissues. Stump sees no reason for calling pain unpleasant. Unpleasantness is the qualitative character of pain. We do not need to postulate a second sort of mental element to tell us that pain is painful. There are no pleasant parts, although we may have pain sensations and agreeable sensations simultaneously from different parts of the body. As for pleasantness, it seems to be connected with sex, tickle, and itch, although no distinct sense organs for pleasure have yet been isolated. It is said that Stumpf once remarked that they would undoubtedly be found by the time of the second coming of Christ. Be that as it may, 45 years have elapsed since Goldenscheider and 16 years since the publication of Stumpf's article, and pleasantness nerve endings have not yet appeared. However, says Stumpf, pleasantness and unpleasantness are sensations, and if the histologists have thus far failed to produce appropriate sense organs, so much the worse for histologists. In brief, Stumpf embraces the sensory theory not because any conclusive evidence of its truth has yet appeared, but because it is less ridiculous than either of the other 2 hypotheses. The James Lange theory of the emotions, as generally understood today, identifies emotion with organic sensation, or at least regards organic sensation as the essential factor in emotional experience. According to this view, we perceive an exciting object. Certain muscular and visceral responses occur, which result in the conscious experience called emotion. To quote James, common sense says we lose our fortune, are sorry, and weep. We meet a bear, are frightened, and run. We are insulted by a rival, are angry, and strike. The hypothesis here is to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, that the one mental state is not directly induced by the other, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful. As the case may be, without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. We might then see a bear and judge it best to run, receive the insult and deem it right to strike, but we should not actually feel afraid or angry. As Calkins pointed out, the James Lange theory is a theory of the complex emotion, not of the elemental feeling. And James himself never denied the existence of elemental consciousness, of pleasantness and unpleasantness. However, the theory is today quite generally applied to the affective process as well. Munsterberg states the thing unambiguously. James Lang and others have taught us how to regard the emotions as the mental effects of reflexively excited peripheral processes. We may extend this principle from emotion to the simple feelings, and may affirm that reflexively excited extensions and flexations are the conditions of the conscious process that we term pleasantness and unpleasantness. Whitmer gives a clear exposition of a similar view. When the external stimulus acts upon the body, its total effect is not merely the sensation ordinarily excited by it. Every stimulus produces more or less remote effects upon many portions of the body. Thus, ammonia may stimulate the sense organ of smell, but it also acts through the brain and spinal cord to affect the heart and breathing. Every such change in the body has a mental accompaniment which will be associated with the primary mental result of the stimulus. The reflex stimulation of remote parts of the body takes place so rapidly that these mental resultants are combined with that of the stimulus. Would we fear a thunderstorm? Do not the intense light and sound stimuli cause the heart to beat violently and the breathing to become irregular, and also to act upon the muscles to produce a temporary weakness and trembling of the limbs? The agreeableness and disagreeableness associated with sensations is in like manner due to combined elements which have an origin elsewhere in the body, that in the sense organs and nerves directly excited by the stimulus. Woodworth says very much the same thing. Feeling is impulsive. In pleasantness, the impulse is to stand pat and let the pleasant state continue. In unpleasantness, the impulse is to end the state. The impulse of pleasantness is directed towards keeping what is pleasant, and the impulse of unpleasantness is directed towards getting rid of the unpleasant. The indifference there is no tendency either to keep or to get rid of. These facts are so obvious as scarcely to need mention, yet they may be the core of this whole matter of feeling. Certainly they are the most important facts yet brought out as relating feeling to conduct. Miss Woolley combines Stump's theory with the James Lang theory, and rejects Stump's assertion that the psychic kernel of an emotion is divorced from sensations. She would say, simple affections are sensations of pleasure and of pain. Then, by the complication with or addition of motor and organic sensations, we should pass through intermediate states until we reach a very complex state in which muscular and organic elements predominated. This state she would call an emotion. This conception, she says, throws light on whether or not qualities additional to pleasantness and unpleasantness are to be accorded to the affections. Titchener, although defending most vigorously the view that affection is elemental, finds time to write. I hazard the guess that the peripheral organs of affection are the free afferent nerve endings distributed to the various tissues of the body. We must, of course, except those at the periphery of the body, which are probably the organs of pain. In other words, he certainly implies the sensory nature of feelings and assumes end organs just as Nicholas Stumpf and Woolley did. Turn the page. Müller-Freinfels holds what has been called a genetic biologic view of the affections. As far as I have been able to understand it, he regards both sensation and affection as elemental, and both as modifications and specifications of an ordinarily undifferentiated consciousness. Organic processes he calls neither sensation nor affection, using the term organic consciousness instead. Anyhow, he argues throughout for a greater recognition of kinesthetic and visceral factors in consciousness, and it seems correct to state that the affection, which he terms an element, bears the character of kinesthetic and organic sensation, for he constantly refers to the psychic correlate of activity, to tendency, and to trieb. S.C. Fisher defends a modified James Lange theory, calculated to meet Titchener's greatest argument against all sensory theories, namely the matter of clearness. As all good introspectionists know, the affective process cannot be brought into the focus of attention. When we try to examine them, they vanish. Fisher fits all sensations into a descending scale of clearness attributes. Visual sensations are clearest, auditory sensations next, and so on down to the organic sensations which are least clear. These organic sensations are the feelings. Pardon me. In this connection, it is interesting to note the table in which Whitmer arranges the groups of sensations in order from the least to the most qualitatively specialized sensations, as follows. 1. Organic sensations, as hunger, thirst, and sensations depending upon a diffused internal stimulation, anywhere within the body. 2. Kinesthetic sensations, which differ quantitatively depending upon the region of the body from which they come. It is impossible to prove that any sensation exists without some admixture of kinesthetic sensation. 3. Sensations of tickle, tingling, motion over the skin, etc. 4. Sensations of touch, pressure, heat, cold, pain, salt, sour, bitter, sweet, and sensations of smell. Auditory sensations is 5. And 6. Retinal sensations, combined with kinesthetic sensations from the eye muscles. These are commonly known as visual sensations. Watson, influenced no doubt by the Freudians, further modifies the theory, advanced principally by Stumpf and accepted and amended by Helen Thompson Woolley, viz., that affection is really organic sensation. He says in part, the Stumpf-Woolley view may be modified and stated in more definite terms. Every stimulus which calls out either overt or delayed responses arouses concomitantly? That doesn't make any sense. Concomitantly, reflexively, a definite and complex group of afferent impulses from tissues, not specified definitely by the authors. We assume that the tissue in question belongs to the reproductive organs and to the related erogenous zones. The area involved in sex functions embraces a much wider zone than that of the sex organs proper. The erogenous zones are in infancy widely distributed throughout the body surfaces. Only gradually does the sex organ come to be looked upon as the focus of sex experience. Even in the case of most adults, certain of these primitive zones remain functional, as e.g. the nipples, etc. This area as a whole may be looked upon as initiating impulses of two fundamental kinds. 1. A group connected with tumescence and rhythmical contractions of other muscular tissues, and with increases in the quantity of various secretions. This group, if functioning alone, as it does in cases of sex response, would lead to the expansive or seeking movements, and ultimately to the unfolding of the instinctive mechanism of the act of reproduction, ending in the orgasm. 2. A group connected with the shrinkage of the sex organs, relaxation of other muscular tissue, and with the inhibition of secretion. These impulses gain the motor centers. These impulses, gaining the motor centers, would, if no other inhibitory in character were present, release movements of avoidance. When a definite sexual stimulus is presented, granting a certain psychological condition, proper seasons, etc., a heightened tonus is produced in the skeletal muscles, and there are certain changes in the circulatory, secretory, glandular, and muscular mechanisms. These are the bodily reverberations, to use James' term, or in the language of current psychology, the bodily substrata of the emotion of pleasantness. And the general psychological condition is unfavorable to sexual activity. On the other hand, the stimulus produces a lack of tonicity in the muscles, a checking of secretion, etc., which arouse in turn a definite group of afferent impulses, bodily substrata of unpleasantness, that tends definitely to set free the avoiding reaction. Since the mechanisms involved in sex are fundamental, it seems reasonable to suppose that every object, either instinctively or through habit, tends to throw them into one of the other forms of action, of which we have just spoken. Certainly, many objects, non-effective stimuli distantly or not at all connected with sex stimuli, do not, in the beginning, arouse these groups, but through the ordinary mechanism of habit, come later to arouse faintly the one or the other. There is evidence in sexual pathology to show not only that such habit connections are formed, but also that they can become more fundamental than the primal instinctive pathways, as is shown in the case of phallic symbols, fetishes, etc. We thus seem to be able to connect the so-called affective processes definitely with general processes of adjustment. Wow. Okay, here we go. Cottonmouth break. Watson makes these sensations from the sex zones responsible for the so-called preferences, which play so great a part in the daily life of the human being, and for the many forms of artistic, aesthetic, and religious modes of response. To those who have inherent objections to admitting that the aesthetic, artistic, and religious sides of life are at bottom sexual, this view will not sound convincing. Fortunately, thanks to the work of the scientific students of social phenomena, we are fast losing our prejudice against admitting the sex references of all behavior. Although admitting the failure of the expressive method in the past to show any constant psychological processes occurring in the conjunction with the examination of pleasant and unpleasant objects, Watson still hopes for results from galvanometric and petrosomographic studies of the sex organs themselves. I think they just make these fucking words up. Our present feeling is that we have taken over this is plethysmograms, Plethyshymograms. They just made that shit up. From the wrong organs, whether there are too many technical difficulties in the way of the objective registration of the many delicate changes in the sex organs, circulation, secretion, etc., remains for the future to decide. A chronological review of the literature of the sensory theories would run something like this. Taine, 1871, and Bain, 1875, regarded pleasure and pain as tactical, cutaneous, and organic sensations. James, 1884, Lang, 1885, and Sergey, 1885, identified the emotions with kinesthetic and visceral sensations. Goldscheider, 1885, reported the discovery of specific cutaneous nerve endings for pain. Blix, 1885, seriously questioned Goldscheider's work. Munsterberg, 1892, extended the James Lang theory of the emotions so as to include the simple feelings. Nicholas, 1892, accepted Goldscheider's pain spots and assumed specific pleasure endings also. Bourdon, 1893, identified unpleasantness with pain and pleasantness with the sensation of tickle. Goldscheider, 1894, seems to have recanted what he said in 1885 about specific pain endings. Von Frey, in 1894, snatched up the fallen banner of Goldschneider, claimed to have isolated pain endings of his own, and defended the Platonic theory that pleasure is negative, the mere absence of pain. Veit, in 1903, and Lagerborg, in 1906, identified pleasantness with sex and unpleasantness with pain. Stumpf, in 1906, elaborates and modifies Nicholas's position. Woolley, in 1907, virtually adopts Stumpf's theory, at least as far as the simple feelings are concerned. Titchener, 1908, although ostensibly trying to discredit all sensory theories, hazards the guess that the free nerve endings are the receptors of affection, thus implying the sensory nature of the feelings and really lining up with Nicholas, Stumpf, and Woolley. Fisher, in 1913, modified the James Lang Munsterberg doctrine to meet Titchener's clearness argument. She clarified all sensations as to clearness and identified the organic sensations, which are the least clear, with the feelings. Müller-Freinfels, 1914, posts an effective element, but gives it the character of organic sensation and kineticus. Watson, in 1914, influenced perhaps by Flight, Landborg, and the Freudians, modified the Stumpf-Woolley view and places the affective end organs in the sex organs and erogenous zones. The chief evidence for the sensory theory of the feelings is simply the fact that there are no adequate arguments advanced against it. The arguments advanced by Kolpe in 1893 completely demolished the attribute theory, so that we have only to choose between the view that feelings are identical with sensation and the theory that they are elements of consciousness distinct from sensation. And that ends part 2 of book number 727, The Psychology of the Affections, written by Vance Randolph. Join me in part 3 for part 3. Thanks for listening.